The motion for this debate is: this House believes that nations which refuse to include women athletes in their teams should be barred from participating in the Olympic Games. Without further ado, I invite the first speaker of the proposition to open the debate. Please welcome Samuel Whitberger.
Ladies and gentlemen, Proposition firmly believes that we will be putting women firmly on the track towards greater equality. Before moving on to our positive matter, let's first look at a few definitions. First, by women athletes, we refer to female competitive athletes who compete in professional sporting events. Second, by teams, we refer to national squads of athletes who are sent to participate in a variety of competitive sporting events. And lastly, by the Olympic Games, we refer to the largest international competitive sporting event. It is generally recognized as the pinnacle of sporting excellence. Therefore, Proposition will be adopting a three-step policy. First, for nations that refuse to include women athletes in their squads, we will ban them from the Olympics. Second, we are willing to ban them from all other international competitions as well, such as, for instance, the FINA World Swimming Championships or the Football World Cup. Third, we have a track record of success for our policy, as seen in Bahrain in 2008. Upon the threat of a ban from the Olympic Games, they included female athletes in their squad, such as the creation of an entire female football team, as well as female track athletes. Therefore, Proposition will be forwarding three key arguments. First, that we have a moral compulsion to ban such nations. Second, that we empower women in sport. And third, in my second speaker, that this liberalizes female mindsets. I'm moving on to my first argument, that we are morally compelled to ban such nations. The thesis of my argument is that the Olympic Committee has a moral duty to act in what is line with its own principles. I'm going to start from a very simple premise, that the Olympic Charter itself enshrines basic equality. The very first article of the Olympic Charter enshrines the right of every person, regardless of gender, ethnicity, or religious belief, to access sport. Therefore, sport is seen as an aspirational quality. It represents how humans seek to constantly break the boundaries of physical and mental limits, pushing the boundaries of human achievement and excellence. Therefore, sport needs to be accessible to each and every individual human being. Men, therefore, have no more of a right to compete in sport as opposed to women. Therefore, if a country only includes men on its squad and not women, we are justified in excluding them. Why is this the case? No country has an absolute or inalienable right to participate in the Olympic Games. Why is this the case? We only grant nations the right to participate in the Olympics when we recognize that they accept the principles of the Olympic Charter and they act in accordance with them. Yes, ma'am?
Okay, so you talked a lot about this Olympic Charter. Are you also aware that in the Olympic Charter it is equally enshrined that the Olympics is not a place for political movements or ideologies?
Oh yes, madam, we agree that it's not about political movements. But if your side is going to be considering gender equality a political movement, we think that's extremely regrettable, because gender equality is something which supersedes any form of political ideologies whatsoever. It's a basic human right, and that is what side proposition stands for. Therefore, I'm moving back to my constructive matter. Thus, the Olympic Committee itself is justified in banning countries from participating. Moreover, we argue that they should be banning these countries from participating because a failure to do so would mean that the International Olympic Committee implicitly condones such discriminatory practices. Why? This means that on one hand, they themselves will be advocating equality in all aspects, such as gender equality. Yet on the other hand, they will be allowing nations which actively repress women to compete in the Olympic Games. We cannot allow such inherent contradictions to appear within the Olympic Games. Why? Sport itself has always been a mechanism to propel equality forward. What do we mean by this? Let's take a very simple example of South Africa during the apartheid regime. In 1987, they were banned from the Rugby World Cup, which was held in New Zealand because of the discrimination during the apartheid regime. And the exclusion of South Africa for all these rugby international sporting events was one of the key instruments in ending the apartheid regime in 1991. Therefore, that's our other track record of success to prove that we are actually successful in doing so, and that sport is a key mechanism to propel equality further forward. Thus, the principles of the Olympic Charter create a moral imperative for us to ban these discriminatory practices. Thus, we are principally justified in adopting our policy. I'm moving on to my second argument. about empowering women in sport. The thesis of my argument is simple, that we push nations to accept women and bring them into their sporting teams. I'm going to start from the premise that countries want to participate in the Olympics. Why is this the case? Countries take pride in athletes who represent them at the Olympics. I'll take you in a moment. 1. It is the dream of every professional athlete to represent his or her country at the Olympic Games. And this is the reason why countries always pour money to create rich sporting cultures within their own countries. For instance, Jordan's 2004 Olympics team received up to $5.3 million across nearly a decade of training in attempts to build up a rich sporting culture. Yes?
Okay, do you really think that a country will prioritize the want to compete in the Olympics Games over centuries of culture and religious beliefs that are enshrined in their country?
Yes, madam, we sincerely believe so, and I'll be explaining why in the rest of my substantive you want to listen out for that. Threatening to bar them from the Olympics Games makes them include women. Why is this the case? And here's where I respond to their POI. The first reason is because of the massive sunk costs which are established in building up these sporting cultures. Countries have to pour huge amounts of money into things like facilities and infrastructure, or other things such as training regimes to make sure they can train up their athletes. And in threatening to bar countries simply because they don't include women, it's a very simple step to simply bring women into their sport so they can actually make use of the massive amounts of money that they've poured into creating these rich sporting cultures. But the second reason to do so is because men themselves want to compete. And recognizing that within all the countries the opposition is going to talk about, all these patriarchal nations, men themselves recognize that as professional athletes, they want to reach the pinnacle of sporting excellence. And they do so by competing in the Olympics. If they recognize that they are going to be barred from doing so and prevented from achieving their dreams, men themselves in these countries will become key instruments in pushing their own sporting committees to include women so that these men are able to have the opportunities to compete in the Olympics themselves. And this is the key mechanism for why these countries will actually include women within their squads. So why is this actually good for women? There are two reasons for this. First, they will be able to pursue sport, something which is their right, and this is of imperative importance. But second and more importantly, they will be able to serve as role models and a source of inspiration for all the women in their countries back home. Let's give you an example of this. In the 2000 Sydney Games, the participation of the female Tunisian Abdullah Jaya Sansia in swimming increased the number of female youth activists back home in Tunisia by 42%. What does this mean? Opposition may tell you after this that countries may pull out from the Olympic Games altogether. Why is this something which is still better? We recognize that we will be able to empower women to know what their rights are. Why is this the case? For instance, if a country is banned solely because they didn't include women in their squads, then women within that country will know that they have an inherent right to participate in sport. And it is of crucial significance because it sparks a change in mindsets of women, especially within these patriarchal nations. Therefore, sport is a mechanism to push forward feminist activism to push for greater equality. If we do not ban such countries from participating, there will never be any incentive to change the kind of discriminatory practices which are currently in place. Thus, we must ban such nations to empower women in sport. Proposition is proud to stand by the base principle that by enforcing this policy, we put women on the track to greater equality.
Speakers spoke for 7 minutes and 58 seconds.
I thank the first proposition speaker for his speech. And now to open the case for the opposition, please welcome Lily Kim.
When it has been enshrined in the Olympic Charter to reject political ideologies and expressions, we don't think the Olympics is the right place to be launching a feminist campaign. And on this basis, we are so proud to oppose the resolution today. Now, inside opposition, we're going to be bringing forth a case to you in three main contentions. Firstly, I'm going to be talking about the universal opportunity and right of participating. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about the contention of the nature of the Olympics. And thirdly, my partner Grace is going to be talking about female empowerment and clashing ideologies. But before I go into my first contention, let's go into some rebuttal and some of the major flaws we saw inside proposition today. Now, they tried to tell us that women's rights are going to be further benefited. We agree that women's rights are good. We agree that yes, women need to have rights, but we don't think the Olympics is the right place to be enforcing this. Firstly, we don't actually think that it'll help or benefit women, because even if women were to be sent, because of their status would be staying the same in that certain country, we don't think that their status would be like suddenly increasing because they're being sent to the Olympics. So we don't think that stands. And even if now they aren't going to be sent, we don't think that this would happen. We don't think they're actually going to be sent to the Olympics, because these countries who are oppressing these females are not suddenly going to think, oh, because these Western countries are telling me that I can't go to the Olympics, I'm suddenly going to give all my women in my country every single right they deserve. We don't think this stands. We don't think this is realistic in these certain countries they're talking about. Now, they also talked to you about how this Olympic Committee has to be doing this, how the IOC has to be implementing these resolutions, but we don't think this actually will happen, because the IOC has said that they aren't going to be banning countries because of certain rights. The nature of the Olympics is to not restrict certain ideologies of countries, right? We think the Olympics is not a westernized event. It is not owned by the Americas and its ideologies. We think the important thing is that the Olympics is something that is international, as they have defined, and by international, it means we have to be accepting every single country's stances, right? Now, they also said that we'd be banning all countries, and to do this, we would require the support of the IOC, but the problem is the IOC would never ban a country from competing, because, again, the Olympics is purely about the right to compete, and the Olympics' priority is to host the event, is to host countries, and not certainly ban and restrict countries from, competing. We don't think this stands, and we think that they have to show us how does it actually benefit women's rights, right? We have two responses to this. Firstly, we don't think, again, the country would change their status if they had these ideologies for centuries. But secondly, what's more worsening and what's worse for these women in these certain countries, it would actually create backlash within the country, because now the view on these certain women in the certain country is because of these women, because of you we can't compete, because of you we can't go to the Olympics, and we think this poses some backlash within that certain country. Okay, now let's go into my first contention about the universal opportunity and the right of participating, not at this moment. We think it's important for everyone to have the right to participate and the right to sport, and we want women to compete, but in certain countries they aren't allowed, and we don't think that it's the Olympics' job to be enforcing a feminist campaign in these certain countries. And this is because these countries are not letting these women compete. We don't think it's our job, it's the responsibility of the IOC to suddenly change these governments' views. We don't think it's realistic for these governments who have had ideologies for centuries and centuries, political, social, religious, and cultural beliefs that deny these women to compete. They're suddenly going to change their views. We don't think that's realistic. Sure, I'll take you.
Is the right of a woman to similarly participate a Western concept or an internationally agreed upon principle?
Okay, we think that POI doesn't stand because firstly, again, in these certain countries, women do not have the same rights in that country, right? We think it's important to recognize that yes, women should be competing, but it's not necessarily the Olympics' job to be doing this. And secondly, they're denying the fact that men cannot compete when you're not sending these women, right? Now we're saying that we have to equalize men and women's rights, but on side proposition, they're saying if these women are not competing, if these women are not going, we're now going to be banning these certain men from competing. We don't think this is fair because now on side opposition, we think we have to equalize men and women's rights. We think that these countries have had these stances, and because of these stances, we can't have Western countries telling them to include women and that they're going to change overnight. Again, this is not realistic. They're not going to change. But instead, we think they're actually going to refuse to compete overall as a country, and effectively this now denies both men and women, and we don't think this is fair because now men who want to compete in the Olympics, who have dedicated their whole lives in these certain countries, cannot go because of the government, because of the IOC, because the Olympics are now telling that they can't go. We ultimately don't think we should be prioritizing women over men in a purely sport, purely performance thing like the Olympics. We think this resolution makes men and women not go because, again, these countries are not suddenly going to change their ideologies. Let's move on to my second contention about the nature of the Olympics. Now, are the Olympics the place for implementing this sort of resolution? We think that the ideology behind the Olympics is that it's anti-political, and Proposition cannot ignore that. We cannot ignore that the Olympics is a purely sport-driven, purely performance-driven thing, performance-driven event. We don't think the Olympics is a universal place for political expression. The sport is the final venue in which it is purely about the game. It's about fair play, and Olympics aren't about gender, it's not about politics. Today, political expression is not allowed, and that's okay because the Olympics is, again, purely about the sport. Let's look at two examples. When two black men who were placed first and third in a track event gave their black empowerment movement salute in a single black leather glove, we saw them lose their medals. Again, we see athletes wearing gay pride symbols and they get disqualified. This isn't because the Olympics don't believe in certain rights, it's because the Olympics isn't about political and social expression. It's not about saying you're gay or that I'm from a certain descent. It's about having national pride. It's not about having political expression or social change or creating a feminist campaign, a feminist movement. It's about the sport, and we think Proposition isn't standing on that ground. We think that's wrong. No, thank you. Now, we think the stance of the Olympics has dated back to ancient Greece and is enshrined in the Olympic Charter again. We think in the times of Greece, the Olympics, when they were held in Athens, that the war parties traveling to the event would not be attacked. This just shows that the Olympics has been a place for peace and not for different forcing political Western ideologies on countries, which this resolution does. We think on side opposition, we don't think it's fair to prioritize women over men. And we think that because this resolution won't work, and it hurts more people than it helps, because now men are not going to be given this privilege of competing, and also because it undermines the Olympics, and it does not have effect on the women, because now they're going to have a bad status in their country, that we have to strongly oppose the resolution today. Thank you.
Speakers spoke for 7 minutes and 46 seconds.
I thank the first opposition speaker for her speech. And now to continue the case for the proposition, please welcome Timothy Ong.
There are two questions that I'm going to ask in this debate. The first is, will nations choose to send female athletes in the first place? And the second question I'm going to ask is, why do we use the specific vehicle of the Olympics as a means to empower women? On my first question, we think their first speaker failed to give us sufficient analysis on why it's the duty of the International Olympic Committee to adhere to the values in its charter and enforce them in real practice. First, we say it's hypocritical for the IOC to be working in this way that specifically backtracks on their equality. Secondly, we give you the example of Russia, where the IOC is already condemning Russia's exclusion of LGBT movements in that country on that basis. Therefore, we think it's fine to say that the IOC acts on the values of its charter all the time. Furthermore, we think that the culture in this case will change. Here's why. Number one, the religions that they talked about in their own substantive are dynamic. We think these countries are already on an increased trend of liberalization and are increased change of sacrificing those traditions because they realize they can't become pariah states in today's world. Therefore, we think there's a track record of success in nations choosing to change their policies. For example, in Bahrain, where we told you in 2008, they came into the Olympics after we forced them to have a women's football team. We also give you the example of South Africa, which broke its long-time tradition of apartheid in order to adhere to its tradition of rugby success. Therefore, we think there's a track record of countries using this pressure and under this pressure, conceding their own tradition. Therefore, since countries are unlikely to pull out in the first place, this negates all of the benefits that they claim on their side. The idea of backlash is not present if nations agree to this in the first place, and all the other benefits that stem from its premise don't accrue. I'm going to ask my second question now. Why do we use the specific vehicle of Olympics as a vehicle for empowerment? Yes, madam.
Okay, so you said that this backlash won't occur if countries agree, but you also told us that they really want to go to the Olympics. What if they agree and then punish the women in their country because they had to make this sacrifice?
Madam, we think it's okay if women are given the right to participate in the Olympics in the first place. It's better than any alternative you have on their side, where they continue to be oppressed and denied the right altogether. I'm going to move on now. Here we dealt with the value of Olympics in my substantive. I'm going to take down their first substantive on this being a political imposition. First, as my speaker's POI already pointed out, this is a fundamental human right, not a political construct that we impose upon countries. We think that it's entirely fine to have equality of women as a fundamental construct and a political construct, and it's perfectly fine. Furthermore, I'm going to take down their language that they say the game must go on anyway. We say it's unfair for the game to go on when women can't even access the game in the first place. Therefore, on the comparative, our side is better. I'm going to prove and address their substantive on why the status of women actually improves under our side. First, we gave you in our first speaker analysis on why these people become role models for their countries. When women and girls in these countries can see their own fellow females being empowered on an international stage, it gives them the voice that would otherwise be absent on their side. I'm going to deal with the idea of backlash here. First, we empower male athletes to speak up on behalf of their female counterparts. If, as they claim, nations are desperate to go to the Olympics, male athletes will therefore campaign for their female counterparts to go to the Olympics with them. This therefore means that men are able to stand up in support of women. This is far better than any patriarchal imposition that their side has that is completely dominated by men continuing to shout misogynistic norms. Furthermore, we think this backlash won't occur because the West already condemns these countries all the time. The difference between the West condemning them and the IOC condemning them is that the IOC contains other countries that are undoubtedly not Western. Nations like Thailand, Nigeria, and Kenya will be joining the support of this movement. Therefore, Western pressure exists on their side, but we give the backing of the entire international community on our side. Therefore, it's not a Westernized concept. Furthermore, we give you analysis in my first speaker that even if nations don't participate, this still helps women to know their rights and still creates an incentive that there is none on their side. Therefore, for all these reasons, even in the worst case scenarios where nations don't choose to send their women, it's still comparatively better on our side. I'm going to transition to my substantive now on how we liberalize female mindsets. The thesis of this argument is that women's participation in the Olympics breaks the patriarchal monopoly on this cause. I'm going to start from a simple premise, that women athletes from such countries like Qatar, no thank you madam, come from immensely patriarchal societies. This means that the discourse that women are exposed to is monopolized by misogynistic sentiment. Every day, women are exposed to rhetoric that reminds them of their unequal and subservient position in society, which places immense societal pressure on them. This creates an oppressive atmosphere that denies women the chance or the viewpoints to speak up for equality, since they're not even exposed to these ideas in the first place. Therefore, allowing women to participate breaks the monopoly on discourse. Why? On an international level, I'll take you in a moment, madam, athletes from all countries, some from more liberal backgrounds and some from more conservative backgrounds, interact and talk to each other. Numerous opportunities on and off the pitch are therefore able for people to explore the views of different athletes. Before I move on, yes, madam.
So you realize that just because these women are going to the Olympics does not mean they're not going to be oppressed in their countries.
Madam, first, we think if women are able to talk to the news in the Olympics, when they return to their countries, international support for their plight is a lot more. Second, they don't even get to go to the Olympics in your side. Therefore, on the comparative, women aren't even able to access their fundamental rights in the first place. Therefore, I'm going to move on to my substantive. As female athletes, for example, talk about what life in their own countries are, or what the norms are in those countries, it helps athletes to learn about each other's backgrounds and the cultures of different nations. For women from patriarchal societies, this interaction is fundamental in providing new viewpoints that they are never exposed to before. Exposure to ideas such as women's equality or gender empowerment breaks the monopoly of discourse that they are exposed to back home. This provides them with a channel to hear alternative viewpoints to oppressive societal stigma. For example, Asal Amin, a footballer in Bahrain's football squad, was able to advocate women's rights in her country after her own team started participating in international tournaments and competing with other nations. Therefore, this is important because female athletes return to their home countries and talk to their coaches, to their fellow athletes, and to their teammates. This allows them to no longer be restricted to the stifling, limited discourse that is imposed on them. As athletes, for example, training with their teammates or coach aspiring athletes in the future, it gives them opportunities to spread their views. Therefore, participation in the Olympics is instrumental for this alternative platform of discourse. Why is the Olympics a particularly important place for this? Because Olympic athletes are given the highest profile and the highest respect. Number one, with media attention focused on them, they are best able to share their plight to people of their own country. Second, because of their own success, they are held in higher esteem by their peers, who view them as people who have competed on an international level and achieved the highest pinnacle of success. Therefore, when these women are able to come back to their country and talk about women's rights and talk about women's equality back home, people will respect them and will listen to them. This allows them to be more receptive to the views of these athletes. Therefore, this liberalizes female mindsets in these countries. It allows women to break free from the rhetoric of the patriarchy. On their side, none of these benefits accrue. Women in domestic societies which oppress them so badly as they claim are given no opportunity to hear talk or even the concept of women's rights in the first place. There are no role models, there are no advocates for these movements in the first place. Therefore, on the comparative, because they gave us no alternative, our side better liberalizes women's discourse. For all these reasons, we are very proud to stand by the base principle that we set women on track for female empowerment.
Speakers for 7 minutes and 59 seconds.
I thank the second proposition speaker for his speech, and now to continue the case for the opposition, please welcome Grace Hua.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we've seen two opposing sides today, both that offer views on how to help women. We've seen a side proposition today who has wanted to impose a policy of giving these women a handout, to just giving everything to them. And on the other hand, we've seen a side opposition who wants to give the women a hand up and get themselves out. And we see that this is the fundamental difference today, and that is why we are so proud to oppose the resolution before us. All right, before I delve into my constructive case today, this whole idea of female empowerment, let's take a look at some of the things that side proposition has brought to you thus far in today's debate and show you a couple of flaws in their argument today. All right, so first of all, they came up and talked to you about this point about, this moral compulsion that we have to do, right? About how the Olympic Charter enshrines Olympic equality. Ladies and gentlemen, we think that there's a fundamental difference between encouraging something and actually making a mandate out of it, right? We've told you already that the International Olympic Committee actually does not want to censor these types of people or censor countries from competing. So we see, in that sense, they're not actually going to make a mandate out of this, right? Then they came up and told you, well, we're only going to grant the nations to act in accordance with the Olympic Charter. But what we would also tell you is that in the Charter, it also says that no political issues are to be allowed in the Olympic Games. And to that they said, well, no, thank you. Women's rights aren't a political issue. Actually, ladies and gentlemen, they are, right? We see that just like black rights, racial rights, gay rights, we see that the Olympic also prohibits these, yet at the same time, aren't these by their definitions human rights too? And fundamentally, we would tell you that these are also political rights because these different countries have different ideologies that deal with these issues and these beliefs like that, which is why we consider these political rights as well. And once again, we would tell you, the Olympics are not the place to express them. All right, moving on into their second point today, this whole idea of empowering women, right? So we think that it's going to give these women more rights and recognition, right? We think that first of all, this actually isn't true. These countries can choose to skirt the requirements and say only include one woman, right? What effect is this going to have, ladies and gentlemen, on the overall effect? If we have one woman and a team of say like 100 males, right? But furthermore, we would actually tell you that these women are going to be viewed even more as an object because they're going to be viewed as simply something that these countries need to get their team on the Olympics. Not something that's going to promote women's rights in our society today, right? Okay, then they told you, countries are going to want to go to the Olympics because of their rich sporting culture. Ladies and gentlemen, we would tell you that what's even more rich than their sporting culture? Their actual culture. The beliefs that have been enshrined into their minds for thousands upon thousands of years, right? We see that in Sharia law, these women don't have rights. They are locked at home. They are beaten. All of these different things. We don't think that because they have a rich sporting culture, they're suddenly going to ignore all of these things, right? Okay, but furthermore, we think that these countries are going to be even more hesitant to listen to this because this ideology is one that the West is trying to impose on them, and we see that they're not going to want to listen to this. But furthermore, they've told you that, we want to empower women to know that they have a right to participate in these sports. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we think that what we see is more important is the right to empower women to vote, to drive, other things that are so much more important than sports, right? We don't see that if they want to do something that they should be putting this in the sense of the Olympics. I think that when a culture can make people do such radical things, against anti-West sentiment, such as become a terrorist, we don't really think that this is going to force them to listen to these ideas. Okay, moving on into their third point today, how the Olympics allows for more interactions between participants, right? How this is going to expose women to more ideologies that they can now bring home and that they're going to know more about. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a couple of responses to you for this. First of all, we would tell you that if they're exposed to this and then they go back to express this sentiment to their regime, to their government, to their culture, we think that they're going to be killed and they're going to be punished, right? We've seen the example of Malala. We see that she was a girl who tried to promote the right for girls to go to school, and what happened to her in her culture? She got shot, ladies and gentlemen. We see that this is actually going to detriment the women in this way because their culture, their government, they don't accept this type of thing. But furthermore, we would also tell you that there are a lot of people in these countries who already do this, right? Like Malala, who already promote this whole idea of women's rights, of different rights in general. Okay.
Point of information.
Sure.
If the international community backs such active oppression of women, where is the incentive to change ever going to come from?
Well, I'm not really sure what you're really trying to say today, but we think that even if the international community is telling these countries that we want you to support women, it's not like they're going to listen, right? We see that these countries already have anti-West sentiments. That doesn't mean that they're going to change their political views or what they fundamentally believe in. Okay, let's get into a little bit of reconstruction today. So my partner Lily came up and talked to you about, this whole idea of the opportunity and the rights of athletes, right? We've told you how denying this is going to make male athletes, it'll be denying the right of male athletes to compete because their countries are now going to pull out of the Olympics. What they've said to that is that, well, no, the men are actually going to encourage their women now to participate. We think that this is fundamentally hypocritical, ladies and gentlemen. It's hypocritical to say that the men are going to promote their women participating when they're beating their women at home. We don't think that this is a reality that side proposition should recognize in today's society. Okay, and then my partner Lily talked about the nature of Olympics, about how the Olympics are anti-political. They told you that women's rights aren't human rights and that they are human rights, not political issues. But again, we've already kind of taken that down in my refutation today. So let's get into my constructive case today. This whole idea of female empowerment and clashing ideologies. Under this, we have 3 subpoints for you. The first of which being, we think that we need to give women a hand up, not a hand out, right? We see that we fundamentally need female empowerment in the long run and not the short one. We don't think that we should just hand it to them when it's not going to be permanent, right? We think that these females need to be able to achieve this type of human rights, this type of empowerment by themselves, and we think that you can't just hand someone something if they haven't earned it, right? We bring up to you the example of affirmative action in the United States. They had this quota to fill, to try to give black people the opportunity to go to school, but what we see is that there was backlash against these black people because people thought it was unfair, because they didn't deserve it, because they didn't work their way up to it. We see that instead, the status and the equality of women needs to be built up from the ground. We see that you need to take little steps, and an Olympic Games every 2 years really isn't going to do anything in the general scheme, right? We think that why do we respect women's rights in places such as the United States or even in Canada? It's because they had women's rights movements that they toiled over for years and years and years, because that they were built up from the ground up, that people respect these rights, and because we didn't just hand these rights to women, right? But furthermore, we think that they're going to not respect these rights even more when it's handed to them by like a political enemy of theirs, such as the ones that we've been talking to you about, this whole idea of the Western countries trying to hand over Western ideology to these nations that we're talking about today. Okay, secondly, we think that it's actually going to create more backlash towards the women, right? We think that the men are going to blame the women for taking away their opportunity to go to the Olympics, because we proved to you over and over again that these countries aren't going to go anymore because of their ingrained political culture, and they're going to pull out, right? But furthermore, we think that the women are also going to take the backlash to get the Western ideology, right? We see that the men are going to associate them with the West, which is something that they don't fundamentally like. But we see that even if they don't blame the women, then they're going to blame the countries itself, which will then create conflict between countries and conflict between international relations, right? We see that a country like Afghanistan are going to resent the countries that have forced these ideologies upon them, or they're going to resent them for telling them what to do. And we think that it is because this resolution won't work, that it'll hurt more than it helps, and that will undermine the Olympics that we are so proud to oppose. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 16 seconds.
I thank the second opposition speaker for her speech. And to continue the case for the proposition, please welcome Ernest Goh.
I have two questions. First of all, what are the values of the Olympics? Second, how do we empower women on our side of the house? First of all, what are the values of the Olympics? The core clash at the center of this point was our side arguing that the Olympic Charter had a duty to uphold the principles it held here. On the other hand, opposition's counter-assertion was the one line that the Olympics cannot be a political organization. I'm going to break this deadlock once and for all right now. To begin with, we argue that our side is not introducing politics into the game. Why? Because we like to suggest that as a woman, you have the right to take part in sport regardless of which country you exist in. This is a fundamental and international human right. We think it's insulting that opposition calls this something that we're imposing on them. These are not Western ideals. These are something that you deserve regardless of which country you're born in. Therefore, our side is not introducing any sort of human rights or any sort of imposition on their side of the house. In fact, if you listen to the language, they seem to condone the repression of women. Just listen to what they said. They said, we cannot impose our culture on them. These are different ideologies that need to be respected. No, thank you. And they haven't earned it, so we can't give it to them. All of this language just seems to suggest that they are happy with the current repression of women that we think is disgusting. Therefore, on a first level, our side says that we are not introducing politics into the game. But second of all, let's pretend that we did introduce politics in the game. Let's ask ourselves the question, why is the game so important in the first place if it's complicit in repressing women further? Even if our side introducing politics into the game, if this can help the people who most need our help because they're so vulnerable in the present, that our side is proud to make the International Olympics a political game. If this helps the people who most need our help. No, thank you. Therefore, first of all, we stand by the values of the Olympics. I'm going to go on to my second area of rebuttal, which is how we empower women. There are two scenarios that could occur. First of all, that they choose to send, which we argue is the vast majority of cases. No, thank you. But there also is the smaller minority of cases that they argue, where they refuse to send these athletes altogether. I'm going to deal with both of these scenarios one by one. First of all, what happens when they choose to send? I first of all want to argue that this is the vast majority of cases. Why? Because even though opposition's counter-assertion, due to all the lines of analysis we gave you, was to say there are years of culture and religion, let's think about what this patriarchy actually says. This patriarchy actually says that we need to privilege men So the calculus of a man or ruler in Saudi Arabia is this. I can make some compromise and allow some women to take part in the Olympics, and this protects the livelihoods and aspirations of men. So even if they're perfectly willing to make these compromises, because patriarchy is not just about the oppression of women, it's also about benefiting men. And if their livelihoods are destroyed, then clearly this violates the principles that both sides agree that they are quite staunch on. Therefore, even if they are patriarchal, this is exactly why they'll be willing to benefit men and send them to the Olympics, even if this means small compromises. We said this is also why men will push their rulers to begin to allow them to include women as well, so that they can protect their own livelihoods and aspirations. We said there are some costs for infrastructure and training regimes that they are unwilling to give up. Hold on a moment, madam. Therefore, this is principled systemic analysis that we said can push people to accept women as well. This takes down all the argumentation on backlash as well as denying men the right to participate, because in the vast majority of cases, they will still be allowed to take part. Before I move on, yes.
So what happens when women are now looked upon as an object of requirement
Alright,
to compete?
I'm going to take that down right now. Maybe they will be viewed as an object at the start, but because women are as able as men to compete fairly and succeed, as Afghan boxers showed, as Iranian athletes showed, this proves that women are just as equal to men. So they might be viewed as objects in the short term, but in the long term, outside engenders positive perceptions of women. So that's our response to you. So given that women will be allowed to take part on our side of the house, why is this good? We first of all said, this allows them to live their dreams. Whether or not you are born in Iran or Bahrain, you have no less of a right to access your aspirations in the same way that men do. Especially because they agree that everybody has the right to participate in the Olympics. Second of all, we said, this sparks groundswell of change back at home, because they are now seen as role models. They failed to engage with all this argumentation. The only argument they dealt with was my second speaker's constructive argument. We said that this liberalizes perceptions. No, thank you. They said you might be killed and you might experience backlash at home. But we said that might be true, but these are people who are perfectly courageous and willing to risk their lives for the sake of change. Their own example of Malala proves this, because she was courageous enough to express an opinion that, despite being politically unacceptable, sparked off a groundswell of educational movements that allowed even more women in Pakistan to access the schools that they wanted. So even if they are killed or there's some extent of backlash, they consent to this backlash and they are willing to risk their lives because they are courageous. So therefore, that isn't an argument against our side. Finally, they retreated to saying that their status might not change back at home and they're still going to be beaten by men. That might be true, but on the comparative, if this is going to happen on both sides of the house anyway, it's still comparatively better for us to allow them to live their aspirations. Furthermore, to some extent, this also engenders the positive changing of statuses, because they were now allowed to leave the house because you need to do so in order to take part in the Olympics. That's clearly a positive change that's better than restricting women back to their homes. No, thank you. Finally, they retreated this very strange analysis in their second speaker when they said all this change needs to be built up from the ground and cannot be handed to them. I'll first like to point out that in the same speech, she told us that women are as oppressed as to be beaten at home. If this is the case, then they probably are not empowered to fight for change on their own. This suggests that we still need to give them some assistance to some capacity. But in any case, we are not completely giving them their rights. We are empowering the people who matter to go back home to fight for change. So we still fulfill the principles of building women's rights up on the ground that opposition wanted. But my final question to them is, what is their alternative? Because all their questions were this. They said the Olympics is not the right platform. So we asked them, what is theirs? And if you listen carefully in their first and second speaker, they give us no mechanism for change. This suggests that even if outside engenders some form of backlash in the short term, but empowers women in the long term, this is always better than opposition, because they condemn women to the beatings at home by their husbands they didn't consider, and they have no way of changing this because they gave us no mechanism. Therefore, we say on the comparative, outside is clearly better for women. Yes?
Okay, what makes you believe that the International Olympic Committee has more power over these countries and women's rights than the United Nations?
Because the United Nations has attempted to enforce these principles, but only through condemnations. And countries don't tend to be very receptive to this because this doesn't create a positive impetus or incentive for change. We have already tried using the United Nations. They have failed. So this suggests to us that we need an additional backing of the Olympic Committee. Therefore, on the first level, our side is a lot better for people since they will be allowed to take part in the Olympics. Even if they begin to resent the international community, this is fine, because in the long term, when we create a normalization of women's rights, they will begin to accept that women's rights aren't something that needs to be accepted. Therefore, on a first level, since the vast majority of countries will yield to the pressure that outside exerts, outside is best for women. But even in the small minority of cases where people stop going, why is this still justified? I'm going to give you a few arguments why. Even if men cannot participate, this is fine because they are complicit in the oppression of women. If you listen to the language, they say they beat their women. So this suggests to us that at some point we need to stop carrying out the people who already have it so good in all other areas and start thinking about the people who are most vulnerable and most dear to our hearts. So therefore, even if men cannot participate, this is still justified. But furthermore, we said that they really benefit from the exclusion of women in the present. Because women are able to participate, funding is directed to them. They have a monopoly over training regimes. So if they really benefited so much, all outside does is equalize this to an extent, and that's why we are completely justified in denying men the opportunity to participate, even if that exists. Therefore, outside empowers women as well. For all of these reasons, proposition is proud to put women on the right track to empowerment.
Speakers spoke for 8 minutes and 11 seconds.
I thank the third proposition speaker for his speech, and now to continue the case for the opposition, please welcome Tatiana Krishna.
Today, we've seen a side proposition that fundamentally misunderstands how the world works. They fundamentally misunderstand the stubbornness of countries that do not give rights to women, and they fundamentally misunderstand how important culture is to these people, and it's because of this that we see they're really losing today's debate. So I'm going to be crystallizing this for you in 3 main themes throughout the debate today. We're going to be looking at the nature of the Olympics first of all, then we're going to be looking at the right to compete and whether or not people actually will compete, and then we're going to look at women's rights as a whole and how this is going to affect them either positively or negatively. So let's start off with this idea. Actually, first let's look at kind of this overarching question that we heard in their last speech. They told us, well, we didn't provide a platform, so we're not doing anything, and therefore that's just a bad thing. The first thing we would say is it's not our responsibility to provide a platform, ladies and gentlemen. We just have to prove that the Olympics does not need to sacrifice the integrity of the Olympics in order to appease countries in the West or to get women's rights in the East when it wouldn't necessarily work. But the second thing we would tell you is we brought up this DOI about the IFC versus the United Nations, and what they told us is the United Nations was tried and failed, the United Nations used condemnation. The first thing we would say is they're already, like their model is using condemnation too. You're saying you can't compete because you don't have women's rights. That's a double standard, thanks for that. But furthermore, we would say, like, yeah, they failed, that's the point. They made an international charter of human rights, and these countries still aren't following it, ladies and gentlemen. What makes you think that Olympic Games is going to make such a difference, ladies and gentlemen? We don't think it's that important to these countries, despite how much money they might spend on their training centers, which we doubt anyways. So let's get right into this theme about the nature of the Olympics. First of all, let's look at this idea that Lily presented to you about how the Olympics are a time
Point of information.
No, thank you. And first and foremost, they're about the sport, right? And they told you, well, without women competing, it's not really the sport. And the responses we have is, first of all, in a risk situation where these people don't end up going, that means neither men nor women are competing in the sport, and we don't approve of that. But furthermore, we would say even when you let women compete in the sport, you're not really letting them compete in the sport. There's no requirement for letting them compete in sports outside of the Olympics. They could simply just send one woman to the Olympics to fail, maybe not train her, just so that they can send a team, ladies and gentlemen. We don't think that they've really provided this effective mechanism. In fact, they've just turned women into tools to get their teams to the Olympics and to appease international communities. Okay, and then they told us, but if the international community isn't supporting these women's rights, then what do we do? And we would say they're mistaking the IOC for the international community, ladies and gentlemen. We think if you want to be talking about women's rights, you can go to the UN, you can start a petition, but you don't need to involve the Olympics because the Olympics are supposed to be a neutral body that does not focus on this. We think that's what they're still not understanding. Okay, so let's look at this idea about the charter.
They told you that the Charter enshrines the right to equality. They told you that the Charter is about giving everyone equal opportunity. And we agree with this. We think the Olympic does support that, which is why they don't prevent gay people from competing. It's why they don't prevent women from competing. But furthermore, the Olympics also promotes peace. The Olympics promotes anti-conflict, so they would never push this idea of equality when it comes to creating conflict and potentially harming their games. Furthermore, we think they would never put this they would never implement this resolution because it could lead to the risk of teams dropping out. This could lead to less people competing, and that would harm their games. It wouldn't be the best athletes. It wouldn't be the best selection. That's not what the Olympics is going for. We don't think that's what they do. Okay, and then they told you that feminism. It's not a political agenda. It's a universal human rights. We would think not being persecuted for your sexuality is also a human right. We would say not being persecuted for your race is also a human right. And yet, when they won't even let you wear rainbow nail polish to show your support for a movement, why on earth are they qualified to launch a feminist campaign, ladies and gentlemen? We don't think this makes sense, and we think they need to address it instead of just dismissing it by saying universal rights are political rights. Yes.
Part of religion and culture is the view of men as superior authorities. Why will countries now willingly destroy these men's aspirations and refuse to compete?
Okay, we think option one, they don't compete. We think they would be willing to do this because the men are not the government, right? These male athletes aren't the government. The government is going to say, we want to oppress women, we're not going to give them opportunities, because what it's going to do is it could potentially make them think that they have power, and we don't want to start that. But even if they let them go, we think they're going to do it in a way where it still makes them look weak, and it still makes them look as such like just a tool, which I've already explained. We wonder why you're not getting it yet. Okay, let's look at this idea of the right to compete. Let's look at women and men. They told you that women will be able to compete because countries really, really want to go to the Olympics. We would say that this isn't necessarily true. Oh, the mic cut out. Great. Okay, so we would say that they're not going to just put the Olympics above their culture, right? The Olympics aren't that important. We think that the right to a culture is more important than to the culture of sports in these societies, right? But furthermore, we would say they're even if they are competing. No, thank you. We would say they brought up this analogy or this idea that they have great training centers and that's going to make them want to go to the Olympics so they won't waste money. We think that that's not necessarily true, ladies and gentlemen, right? We think that still having women as an oppressed minority in their society is going to be more important than wasting money on a training center, ladies and gentlemen. And then they just need to stick one woman in that training center anyway, so we don't think the resolution is effective. But let's look at men. We told you that men lose opportunity, and their response for only their model in which they actually go would be that men are going to encourage women to go as well. We told you one, that's a double standard. They're beating women at home but also telling them to have rights. We don't think that's going to work out. Two, we don't think they do this anyways. We think they like to oppress women. And three, we would say the men are not the government, right? Even if one athlete that is male wants to promote this sport for women, we don't think that necessarily means that all the others will. And finally, they didn't really recognize the unfair loss of rights to men when the country chooses not to go. They chose just to ignore that part of the debate. So finally, let's look at this theme of women's rights, and let's look about the long term, right? So I told you these women will be pursuing a sport and they'll be seen as role models. And what we told you in response is they're not going to be respected, right? Because in order for women to be seen as role models and really make an influence, they can't just inspire women, they need to inspire the men as well. And we told you that when these women are causing the men to have to lose their place at the Olympics, they're not going to get respect. But furthermore, we told you that when the women get this resolution implemented to get them to the Olympics, it looks like they're being backed by Western ideology, right? Because it's the West. And yes, we recognize that feminism or equal rights is a global initiative. We recognize that it's true. But these countries that don't have women's rights see it as a Western imposition, right? That's how they view it, and that's the problem with their stance here. We think that when they're looking at it as the West is imposing this on us, they're going to associate that with the women. The women will be discriminated against. The women will now get backlash because they're going to look like they've been asking for Western support. And why do we think this is harmful? We think it's harmful because the women aren't even primarily asking to go to the Olympics, right? In these countries, the women want to drive, ladies and gentlemen. We think that when the West is pushing for them to go to the Olympics, they're losing traction, right? Because these countries, governments of these countries are going to think, oh, we're mad at them for this. This is bad. We don't want them doing this. That's going to create more resentment towards women. And when they come up with a legitimate cause that they really truly want and prioritize above going to the Olympics, they'll be shut down because the government is already mad at them and think they're getting too many rights. Okay, so then finally let's look at this idea of women getting backlash and these countries getting backlash, external countries getting backlash because of the government of these countries. And we said, well, these countries are already getting a lot of backlash from Western countries. They're not going to feel bad if they're getting backlash from more places. We would say they don't really care. But when you take away their right to go to the Olympic Games for the people that they endorse, that will make them angry. We don't think it will make them angry enough to override their culture, but it will make them angry enough to take revenge against the women, ladies and gentlemen, because that's what they prioritize. They prioritize oppressing people. They prioritize denying rights, and we don't think that athletes really are prioritized above this culture. Okay. And then they told us, but these women are really used to getting backlash. They're brave and they're courageous and that's fine. We think that that's not true, and we think other women are harmed as a result. It's not just the athlete that gets harmed, it's the rest of the women in the society. So because it doesn't help women's rights, because it goes against the fundamental nature of the Olympics, and because we don't think these people really will get the right to compete, that we are so proud to oppose the resolution.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 17 seconds.
I thank the third opposition speaker for his speech. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now move to the team's 4-minute concluding reply speeches. To deliver the opposition's reply speech, please welcome Grace Huang.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we on side opposition have summed the debate down into 3 key questions. Number 1, how is this resolution going to affect the women? Number 2, how will it affect the countries? And number 3, are the Olympics actually the right place? Now without further ado, let's take a look at my first question today. How is it going to affect the women? So first of all, we've seen a side proposition who has come up here and told you, well, it's going to show more equality by letting them compete. And this was basically the overarching theme that we've heard all throughout the bench today. So we're going to take that down completely right now. We gave you a couple of responses, actually a plethora of responses. First of all, we will tell you that no, the women are going to be viewed even more as an object and something that is not equal because the countries are only going to view her as something that is going to let the countries compete, right? We brought to you the issue of what happens when the countries only place the women in to say fulfill a quota and only put in 1 woman, right? They haven't really answered our question to this today. They've had no response to this whatsoever. Secondly, we've told you that these people and these people in these countries actually value thousands of years of culture over something that they would like to term a sporting culture, right? We think that fundamentally their same religious beliefs, their same fundamental principles and ideologies are going to remain the same. They're not going to change because they somehow want to send 1 woman to the Olympics to compete for their country, right? Thirdly, we've told you that these women are actually going to be portrayed back home as something that is even more inferior and even more weak, right? Fourthly, we've told you that these women aren't actually going to be respected because the men are going to resent the women for taking away their opportunity to go to the Olympics, that the women are taking away the right for their country to say win something, win national pride for their country. And we've also told you that they're not going to be respected because the men are going to associate the women with Western ideology today. And lastly, we've told you under this whole idea about how it's going to show more equality by letting them compete, we've told you that the women don't actually want to go to the Olympics, right? They think that they want to vote. They want to have other fundamental rights that are not, say, just competing at a sporting event. And as my partner Tatiana has just told you, we think that the government might actually deny them of these rights in the future because they're going to say, hey, we already gave you the right to go to the Olympics, so now you don't get to have more important rights like the right to vote, right? Okay, let's move on into my second question today. How is it going to affect the countries? And today's side proposition has tried to tell us, well, the countries are going to accept their women more. But what we've told you to that is that no, the country's actually going to pull out, right? Years and years of this culture isn't going to suddenly just change because they want to win some weird, some sporting event that happens every 2 or every 4 years, right? But furthermore, they've told you that, we're going to make the men encourage the women to go. First of all, we would tell you the men aren't actually the government, right? The men don't have the power to do this. But second of all, they're proposing a double standard here, right? They're saying, okay, we're going to try to give women rights, but at the same time, the men are also going to be beating the women at home and keeping their women locked up. We see that that's a fundamental contradiction today in their case. Okay, and now let's move on to my third and last question. Are the Olympics actually the right place, right? So today's side proposition has told us, well, it's going to give women exposure to new ideas to further human rights, right? Again, we've told you in my rebuttal, and my partner Tatiana's rebuttal already, that this is going to make the women even more subject to harm, right? We've given the example of Malala. We see that their government, their culture isn't going to accept this. Then they've told us, the Olympics ensure equality for all, and women's rights are human rights. Again, we would tell you that women's rights are political and human, but we see it is because of the political aspect as well that the Olympics don't want to include it, right? But furthermore, we would ask you, what about black rights? What about gay rights that the Olympics also prohibit against people displaying? Again, no response to this from side proposition today. Okay. And lastly, they've told you, the Olympics can provide a great mechanism to do this because it's international. What we would tell you is that the Olympics are a place for neutrality, right? It's a place where people come and they compete. If they have issues with the human rights or whatever, we think that they should take it up with the UN, right? We don't see that the International Olympic Committee is actually more powerful than the United Nations, right? So we see that it's because of all of these reasons that we on side opposition have posed to you thus far, we've taken down side proposition's case that we are so proud to oppose. Thank you.
He spoke for 4 minutes and 12 seconds.
Okay.
And to conclude the case for the proposition and the debate as a whole, please welcome Samuel Whitlow.
When gender equality itself is internationally recognized as a basic principle, opposition condemned it as merely a political ideology. Furthermore, when gender discrimination itself is rampant, opposition gave it the go-ahead because it was a cultural norm. Ladies and gentlemen, apartheid itself was once a cultural norm, and we ended it with international sporting bans. By opposition's logic, they would have gone ahead with apartheid. Proposition was very proud to stand by the fact that discrimination against females should never be a norm, and we were very proud to advocate that. By the end of today's debate, two very different worlds had emerged. There was the misguided and inhumane world of the opposition as contrasted to the consistent and understanding world of proposition. And I'm going to take you on a walk through both of them. So firstly, the world of the opposition, where political ideologies had absolutely no place in the Olympics. From the start, opposition told us that cultural norms should be propagated. They didn't want to ban countries who oppressed women because women, as they told us, need to earn their right to participate while men in those countries didn't. Double standards, we indeed thought so, and we proved to you why throughout the bench. Inherently, opposition advocated a men's right to compete that we could never compromise on without ever telling us why or applying the same principle to women. Never once did they actually do so. When did they actually talk about women then? They only actually talked to us about women in their points on backlash. But in their world, women had absolutely no role model to crowd around. Therefore, they could effortlessly push for as much change as they wanted, but they would never be able to achieve it because they didn't have anyone to concretely back and push them forward. Therefore, there was still oppression and they could never actually achieve any change whatsoever. And we proved this to you down the line. So despite claiming to empower females, opposition had absolutely no means of doing so, only telling us that a right to culture which oppresses women is more important than a right to equality in sport. Ladies and gentlemen, we did not want to live in that world. So let's escape to the much better world which we brought to you in the proposition. What did we tell you? Let's start with a very simple analogy. When you have an opening ceremony for the Olympics and women walk out side by side men bearing the national flag, that itself is a very powerful emblem of equality, not just at the international sporting scene itself, but for all the women back home who are fighting for equality, such that when these female athletes return back to their home countries, they have a role model to crowd around, to rally around and actually push for change which is effective in nature. That was what true empowerment actually was. But why would men, therefore, thus advocate female competitive sport? We told you right from the start that the reason why this was so was because it furthered their own ability to participate in sport. Because they recognized that for male professional athletes, they wanted to compete at the Olympics because it was what they desired the most. And to fulfill that desire, they needed women to compete alongside them. And that was the actual reason why men, in their efforts to improve themselves, would help women as well. And we gave you actual real-world examples of where this happened. We told you Bahrain, Iran, Jordan, all of these places were instances where it continuously worked in empowering women. And opposition never actually took down any of the examples that we gave you in the real world, only claiming an apocalyptic scenario of some hypothetical world that they lived in. All these harms. The next thing which we told you was about an inherent moral duty, and side opposition never contested this apart from a political ideology, which we took down anyway. And the last thing which we told you was about female empowerment, about liberalizing the mindsets of female athletes and then taking those mindsets back home so that they could work in their own female communities and rally together around a particular cause and push those causes forward. Ladies and gentlemen, if you don't have a symbol whom you can rally around, someone who can represent you as the face of your movement, you cannot actually achieve change. But that was what proposition actually had. By the end of today's debate, opposition was merely able to prove that our solution wasn't perfect. But the difference was, it was a solution nonetheless in the short term and in the long term. And it's for all those reasons that we are more than proud to propose.
Speakers spoke for 4 minutes and 10 seconds.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending the debate. Please stay in the lecture theatre while the adjudicators leave the room to deliberate on their verdict and will return to give their decision.
Agreement that this was an extremely good debate. The best debate I've seen in Prometheus in the history of Prometheus Cup, to be honest, which is not a very long history, but it says something about the quality of the round in itself. So I'd like to thank both teams for giving us an excellent round. I think they deserve a big round of applause. And in a very good round, you typically have a very close debate. That's why for this round, you have a 2-1 split. And I think I can tell you the margins. The margins are 0.5, 1, and 2. So I'm not kidding when I say this is a very close debate. Some of the panel members actually gave the debate to one side by virtue of the power of the reply, which doesn't really happen in normal scenarios and only happens really in a very close debate. I'm going to go through the issues first, very briefly, what we thought about the debate, and using, I don't want to be a hypocrite if I expect kids to summarize debates in 7 minutes, I'm going to do it in less than 7 minutes. So I hope you're okay with that. You can approach us for comments afterwards. So the first question we ask is, what benefits women? And to this, we kind of feel there's a slight advantage to proposition. Simply because they were able to explain to us the role of icons and leaders and images that emerge in society. But not to say that Canada didn't take this down quite well as well. They did actually question whether these people can be effective icons. For example, Western powers, it will look like Western powers are backing them, or they can easily be like demolished by any other member of that society who doesn't really like women, like the Malala example, which actually Prop did use to their advantage to say, no, actually, even if you shot Malala, she's actually quite still a good advocate because she's courageous, as they said. So in this regard, Prop was quite reasonable in saying that Op should at least show us some other alternative by which that empowerment can emerge. We did hear bits and pieces about movements emerging from the grassroots, some sort of like discussion on how individual women who are already fighting for rights will be downplayed because now there's going to be tokenism, etc. And to be fair to opposition, they tried to take down the point of having icons when the icons themselves can just basically be treated as tools to get to the sports. But the lack of sort of converse for opposition made this issue tilt a little more towards proposition, but not to a large degree. That's why it's a close debate. Ultimately, what swung the debate is a question of, is the Olympics the right venue and is the IOC the right people to do this? Now here, we had a very strong attack from proposition. They said that the IOC is the right body. Even within its charter, it has to be consistent with its principles of equality. Op says, actually this is politicking, and we don't like politicking in the Olympics. We ban things like gay rights, like black empowerment, etc. To which Prop responded, actually no, this is not politicking, this is an international standard of rights. The question therefore becomes, is it an international standard of rights for the IOC? And to this we felt that proposition had to respond to the idea of all other aspects of equality not being allowed in the Olympics. And that lack of response on a 2-1 split gave the debate to Canada.